The departure. The early morning sunlight filtered through the windows of John Hayes's modest home, casting a warm glow on the wall where his military medals hung in a carefully arranged display. John, a 72-year-old veteran, stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his faded military uniform. The jacket, adorned with rows of medals, was a testament to years of sacrifice and service, a lifetime ago on distant battlefields. His scuffed leather boots were polished but showed the wear of decades. Each item of clothing told a story of resilience, loyalty, and dignity. Today, however, the uniform wasn't just about honoring the past. It was about the future, his reunion with Thomas, his best friend and former comrade, whom he hadn't seen in over 40 years. The two had shared everything during the war, the fear, the hope, the sorrow, and the survival. Thomas had moved out west years ago, and life had kept them apart, but not this time. This time, John had promised himself he would make the trip, no matter the challenges. John's son, Michael, a successful entrepreneur, had insisted on booking the tickets for his father. John, ever the modest man, requested an economy-class seat. He didn't want to trouble anyone or seem extravagant. But Michael, knowing his father's humility and the lifetime of sacrifices he had made, quietly upgraded the ticket to business class without telling him. When John received the ticket and saw "business class" printed in bold letters, he smiled softly and shook his head. "That boy worries too much," he murmured, tucking the ticket into his jacket pocket. Despite his gratitude, he felt a twinge of apprehension. Business class was a realm he had never stepped into, and he feared he might feel out of place. The Atlanta airport was bustling with early morning travelers when John arrived. Dragging his modest suitcase behind him, he navigated the chaos with practiced ease, his upright posture and composed demeanor setting him apart from the hurried crowd. Yet, as he approached the priority check-in counter for business class, the stares began. People glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. His military uniform and well-worn boots contrasted sharply with the polished shoes, designer luggage, and tailored suits of the other passengers. Whispers fluttered in the background, their words barely audible but their judgment unmistakable. When John reached the counter, the attendant, a young woman with perfectly coiffed hair, hesitated as she looked him over. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right line?" she asked, her tone polite but tinged with doubt. John nodded and handed her his ticket, his face calm but his heart sinking at the familiar sting of being underestimated. The attendant scrutinized the ticket, glanced at him again, then reluctantly processed it. "You're all set," she said, returning the ticket with a forced smile. John simply nodded, pocketed the ticket, and made his way to the gate. He was no stranger to such encounters. He had faced them all his life, on the battlefield, in boardrooms, and even in casual interactions. But today, he told himself, was about reconnecting with a friend who had seen past all those judgments. The business-class cabin of the plane was a picture of luxury. Plush seats, attentive service, and soft lighting created an atmosphere of exclusivity. As John stepped into the cabin, his presence drew attention. His uniform and boots were an anomaly in the sea of sleek suits and designer handbags. The flight attendant assigned to business class, a young woman named Lucy, noticed him immediately. Her perfectly arched brow furrowed slightly as she watched him settle into his seat. His uniform and unassuming demeanor seemed to puzzle her. Lucy approached with a practiced smile that barely reached her eyes. "Sir, may I see your ticket, please?" she asked, her tone professional but skeptical. John handed her the ticket without a word, his calm gaze meeting hers. Lucy glanced at it, her lips tightening slightly. "Business class," she murmured under her breath, as if questioning how someone like him could afford it. She returned the ticket and moved on without offering the customary welcome drink, leaving John to adjust himself in his seat, his silence dignified. As the plane took off, John stared out the window, his thoughts drifting to the reunion ahead. He remembered Thomas's laughter, the way it had lifted their spirits during the darkest days of the war. He thought of the promises they had made to each other, the stories they had shared. Those memories were a sanctuary for him, a reminder of what truly mattered. The first signs of trouble came when Lucy began serving drinks to the business-class passengers. As she pushed the cart down the aisle, she paused at each seat, offering beverages and snacks with a polished smile. But when she reached John, she hesitated, her gaze flicking over his uniform and boots before she moved on without stopping. At first, John thought it was an oversight. But when she passed him a second time without acknowledging him, a familiar pang of disappointment stirred in his chest. He had faced this kind of treatment before, subtle slights, dismissive glances, but it still stung. When Lucy passed by a third time, John decided to speak up. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely, his voice steady. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" Lucy stopped, her expression neutral but her tone cold. "I'll see if there's any left," she said curtly, as if he were asking for something unreasonable. She returned moments later with a glass of water, placing it on his tray table with a perfunctory motion. John thanked her softly, his tone calm but firm. He didn't let her actions rattle him. He had endured far worse in his life, and he wasn't about to let this moment diminish his dignity. As the flight continued, John's presence in business class seemed to unsettle Lucy. She couldn't understand why a man in such modest attire, with no outward signs of wealth or status, was seated in this exclusive cabin. Her judgments were clear in her tone and mannerisms, but John remained composed, refusing to let her assumptions dictate his behavior. The passenger seated next to John, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, noticed the exchange. He leaned toward John and said quietly, "You must be a patient man to put up with that kind of treatment." John smiled faintly. "Patience comes with time," he said. "Everyone deserves respect, no matter where they're sitting or what they're wearing." The man nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you have my respect," he said. "It's clear you've earned it." As the plane began its descent, Lucy approached John one final time, her expression a mix of discomfort and forced politeness. "I hope you had a pleasant flight," she said, her tone lacking sincerity. John looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady. "Every journey teaches us something," he replied. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that Lucy couldn't ignore. Unbeknownst to Lucy, this flight was about to teach her something too, something that would change her perspective forever. When the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, John calmly gathered his belongings, his movements unhurried. As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he was greeted by a familiar figure, Michael Hayes, his son and the owner of the airline. "Dad!" Michael called out, striding toward him with a broad smile. He embraced John warmly, his respect and admiration evident. Lucy, who had just exited the plane, froze as she overheard their conversation. Her face paled as the realization hit her, this man, whom she had judged so harshly, was the father of her employer. A moment of realization. Lucy stood frozen at the terminal entrance, her mind racing as she watched the scene unfold. There, in the middle of the bustling airport, the black man she had dismissed and disrespected during the flight was being warmly embraced by Michael Hayes, the billionaire owner of the airline she worked for. The contrast between her assumptions and reality struck her like a bolt of lightning, leaving her stunned and uneasy. Michael stepped back from his father, a wide smile on his face. "Dad, you look great. The uniform still fits perfectly," he said, his voice full of admiration. John chuckled, patting his son on the shoulder. "I don't know about great, son. It's a little tighter than it used to be, but it still carries the memories." Lucy's heart sank as she watched their interaction. She realized that the man she had judged so harshly wasn't just another passenger. He was someone who had lived a life of honor, someone deeply respected by the person who held her professional future in his hands. Michael turned to a nearby assistant and gestured for her to bring a wheelchair. "Let's make you comfortable, Dad. I know you've had a long flight," he said. John waved him off. "Nonsense, Michael. I'm perfectly capable of walking. Besides, I'm not about to let a little fatigue stop me from seeing Thomas. As they walked toward the baggage claim, Lucy trailed behind them, her steps hesitant. She couldn't shake the knot in her stomach. The indifference, the sarcastic remarks, the judgmental glances, all of it replayed in her mind, now seen through the lens of her mistake. The man she had treated poorly wasn't just a passenger. He was a father, a veteran, and a man who had earned his place in this world through sacrifice and resilience. John and Michael reached the baggage claim area, where an older woman, Helen, greeted them warmly. Helen, a neighbor of John's, was returning from a trip to visit family and had coincidentally landed on the same flight. "John!" Helen exclaimed, pulling him into a gentle hug. "I didn't expect to see you here." "And Michael?" It's been a while." Michael greeted her with equal warmth, explaining his father's plans to visit his old war buddy. Helen's eyes softened as she took in John's military uniform and the medals gleaming on his chest. "You're still wearing it, John," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. "That uniform represents more than service. It represents a life lived with honor." Lucy, still lingering in the background, overheard the conversation. Her face flushed with shame. Helen's words were a reminder of what she had overlooked, the humanity behind the uniform, the story behind the man. As Michael stepped aside to make a call, Lucy found herself approaching John hesitantly. She clutched her hands nervously, her polished professionalism stripped away, leaving only the rawness of her guilt. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice trembling slightly. John turned to her, his calm, kind eyes meeting hers. "Yes," he said, his tone polite but neutral. Lucy swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. I owe you an apology. During the flight, I treated you with disrespect, and I made assumptions about you that were unfair. I realize now how wrong I was, and I'm deeply sorry." John regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he nodded slowly. "Thank you for your apology," he said. "It's never easy to admit when we've made a mistake." Lucy's eyes brimmed with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "I've learned a lot from this experience," she said. "I hope you can forgive me." John's gaze softened. Forgiveness is not just about letting go of anger, it's about recognizing the potential for growth in others. "I hope this experience stays with you, not as a burden, but as a lesson." Lucy nodded, her heart heavy but grateful for his words. She stepped back, watching as Michael returned to his father's side, their bond evident in the way they spoke and moved together. Later that day, John and Michael left the airport, heading toward Thomas's house. Michael had rented a comfortable car for the trip, insisting that his father rest during the drive. As they cruised down the highway, John gazed out the window, his mind drifting back to memories of the war. "Do you think Thomas will recognize me?" John asked, his voice tinged with a hint of apprehension. Michael glanced at his father. "Are you kidding? He's been waiting for this day for years. Of course, he'll recognize you." John chuckled softly. "Time changes people, Michael. We've both lived a lot of life since then." As the miles passed, the landscape shifted from urban sprawl to quiet countryside. The closer they got to Thomas's home, the more John felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He thought of the last time he'd seen his friend, both of them young men facing an uncertain future. Now, they were old men with a lifetime of stories to share. When they finally arrived at Thomas's house, a small, charming bungalow surrounded by a well-tended garden, John felt a surge of emotion. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The front door opened, and there stood Thomas, leaning on a cane but smiling broadly. "John Hayes." Thomas called out, his voice strong despite his years. "You old rascal, you made it." John's face broke into a grin as he walked toward his friend. The two men embraced, their laughter echoing in the crisp afternoon air. For a moment it was as if no time had passed at all. Michael watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. His father had taught him many lessons over the years, but the one that stood out most was the importance of loyalty, loyalty to family, to friends, and to one's own values. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Lucy couldn't shake the encounter with John. She replayed his calm demeanor, his gracious acceptance of her apology, and the quiet dignity he had carried throughout the flight. For the first time in her career, she began to see her role as more than just a job. It was an opportunity to connect with people, to treat them with the respect they deserved regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Determined to make amends, Lucy approached her supervisor with an idea. "I'd like to start a new initiative," she said. "Something to honor veterans who fly with us. They've given so much for our country, and it's time we showed them the respect they've earned." Her supervisor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That's an interesting idea. What do you have in mind?" Lucy outlined a program that would offer complimentary upgrades to veterans, personalized service, and a small token of appreciation for their service. The supervisor agreed to present the idea to upper management, and Lucy felt a spark of hope. She couldn't undo the past, but she could help create a future where others like John Hayes would feel valued and honored. Bonds forged in time. The warm afternoon sun bathed Thomas's bungalow in a golden glow, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen. John Hayes and Thomas sat on the porch, rocking chairs creaking softly as they swayed back and forth. Between them lay a table with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of homemade cookies that Thomas's daughter had baked for the occasion. Michael sat a few feet away, watching the scene unfold with a quiet sense of pride. Seeing his father reconnect with his best friend was a rare glimpse into a life he only knew from the stories John would sometimes tell. Today, though, the stories were no longer just tales, they were alive in the shared laughter and glances between 2 men who had faced life's most daunting challenges together. "Do you remember the time we were stuck in that bunker for 3 days with nothing but a can of beans between us?" Thomas asked, his voice rich with nostalgia. John chuckled, shaking his head. "How could I forget? You insisted we ration it out, but by the 2nd day, you were eating it straight from the can." "I was starving," Thomas defended, his eyes twinkling with mirth. "Besides, you were the one who kept us sane with those ridiculous stories about what you'd do when you got home." John leaned back in his chair, his smile softening. "We all needed something to hold on to back then. Hope was all we had." The 2 men grew quiet for a moment, the weight of their shared memories settling over them. Michael could sense the gravity of their bond, a connection forged not just in friendship, but in survival. Thomas broke the silence, his voice tinged with gratitude. "You know, John, I've often thought about how lucky I was to have you by my side during those years. There were times when I didn't think we'd make it, but you never gave up." John waved his hand dismissively, though his eyes gleamed with emotion. "We all did what we had to do, Thomas. You were there for me just as much as I was for you." Michael leaned forward, eager to learn more. "Dad never talks much about those days," he said. "What was he like back then?" Thomas grinned, his gaze shifting to Michael. "Your dad? He was a rock. Always calm, always steady. The rest of us would be falling apart, and there he was, keeping us focused. He had this way of making you believe everything was going to be okay, even when it wasn't." John shook his head, a modest smile on his lips. "I just did what I could to keep us moving forward. No point in dwelling on things you can't control." As the afternoon turned to evening, the conversation shifted to their lives after the war. Thomas spoke about his family, his grandchildren, and the quiet joy of retirement. John, ever humble, shared stories of raising Michael and the pride he felt watching his son build a successful business from the ground up. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad," Michael said, his voice filled with sincerity. "Everything I've accomplished is because of the values you taught me: hard work, integrity, and treating people with respect." John's expression softened. "You've made me proud, Michael. Not just because of what you've achieved, but because of the man you've become." Back at the airport, Lucy sat at her desk, reviewing notes for the Veteran Appreciation Program she had proposed earlier. The more she thought about it, the more determined she became to make it a reality. She reached out to the airline's marketing team, pitching the idea with renewed passion. "This isn't just about improving customer service," she explained. "It's about acknowledging the sacrifices these men and women have made and showing them the respect they deserve. A simple gesture can go a long way." Her enthusiasm caught the attention of the head of marketing, who agreed to present the proposal to senior management. Lucy felt a flicker of hope. This was her chance to turn her mistake into something meaningful, a way to honor veterans like John Hayes and ensure they were treated with the dignity they had earned. Meanwhile, Michael suggested that they all go out for dinner at a nearby restaurant to celebrate the reunion. Thomas agreed enthusiastically, and soon they found themselves seated at a cozy corner table, sharing a meal and toasting to old memories. As the conversation flowed, a server approached the table with a bottle of wine and placed it in front of John. "This is compliments of the gentleman at the bar," she said, gesturing toward a man who looked to be in his late 30s. The man raised his glass in a silent salute before turning back to his companions. John looked puzzled, but Michael leaned in and whispered, "I think he recognizes the uniform, Dad." John nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's not about the uniform," he said quietly. "It's about what it represents." The dinner ended with heartfelt goodbyes as John and Michael prepared to head back to their hotel for the night. Thomas clasped John's hand tightly, his eyes misty. "Don't wait another 40 years to visit, old friend." John chuckled. "I won't, Thomas. You've got my word." As they drove back to the hotel, Michael glanced at his father. "How are you feeling, Dad?" John looked out the window, his voice contemplative. "Grateful," he said. "For the chance to see Thomas again, for the life I've been given, and for the people who remind me of what truly matters." The next morning, as they boarded the return flight, John was surprised to find Lucy waiting for him at the entrance to the plane. Her demeanor was different, softer, more respectful. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice sincere. "I wanted to personally escort you to your seat and make sure you're comfortable. It's the least I can do." John nodded, accepting her gesture without hesitation. "Thank you, Mississippi." As he settled into his seat, Lucy ensured he had everything he needed, her actions a stark contrast to her earlier behavior. John could see the change in her, and it gave him hope, not just for her, but for the world. Ripples of change. The return flight to Atlanta was markedly different from the outbound journey. John Hayes sat in his business class seat, once again wearing his military uniform, but this time the air around him carried a quiet sense of respect. Lucy, the flight attendant who had previously dismissed him, now ensured his every need was met with professionalism and care. Her gestures were simple but genuine, a warm smile, an extra blanket, and a drink served promptly. John didn't say much, but his calm, dignified presence seemed to make her determination to treat him better all the more poignant. A shift in perspective. For Lucy, the experience of meeting John had been transformative. As the flight cruised through the sky, she stole occasional glances at him, her mind replaying every moment of their first encounter. His grace under pressure, his humility, and his quiet strength had left an impression she couldn't ignore. Lucy was no stranger to the hustle of her job. She had spent years dealing with passengers of all types, often masking her own exhaustion with practiced politeness. But John's presence had reminded her of something she had lost along the way, a sense of connection to the people she served. After ensuring the other passengers were comfortable, Lucy found a moment to approach John. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, standing beside his seat. He looked up, his expression as calm and kind as ever. "I just wanted to thank you, for your patience, for your service, and for the lesson you've given me." John tilted his head slightly, his eyes filled with understanding. We all have lessons to learn, he replied. What matters is what we do with them. His words struck a chord in Lucy. She nodded, stepping back to let him rest, but her resolve to turn this experience into something meaningful only deepened. A father's wisdom. Meanwhile, Michael sat across the aisle, observing the interaction. He couldn't help but feel a swell of pride for his father. John's ability to command respect without demanding it was something Michael had admired since childhood. It was a trait that had shaped Michael's own approach to life and business. As the plane touched down in Atlanta and they exited the terminal, Michael turned to his father. Dad, you know you've had an impact on that flight attendant, don't you? John chuckled softly. Maybe. But what she chooses to do with that is up to her. Michael shook his head, smiling. You're too humble for your own good. People like Lucy don't just change overnight. You've shown her something she probably hasn't seen in a long time, dignity in the face of disrespect. John shrugged. I've lived long enough to know that you don't fight fire with fire. Sometimes, all it takes is a little patience to spark a change. Lucy's mission. True to her word, Lucy wasted no time turning her newfound awareness into action. The day after the flight, she submitted a detailed proposal to her supervisor outlining a new initiative for the airline, the Veteran Recognition Program. The program aimed to honor veterans like John Hayes by offering them complimentary upgrades, personalized service, and a token of appreciation, perhaps a small pin or a handwritten note of thanks. Her supervisor, intrigued by the idea, asked, "What inspired this, Lucy?" Lucy hesitated for a moment, then spoke candidly. "I met someone on a recent flight, Mr. John Hayes. He's a veteran, a man of incredible dignity and humility. I didn't treat him the way he deserved, and it made me realize how many others might have been overlooked. This program is my way of making sure that doesn't happen again." The sincerity in her voice was undeniable, and her supervisor agreed to present the proposal to senior management. Lucy felt a spark of hope. She knew the road to implementing such a program would be long, but the thought of honoring people like John Hayes kept her motivated. A community impact. Back home in Atlanta, John returned to his quiet routine, but the ripples of his actions were already spreading. News of his journey had begun to circulate, thanks in part to Helen, the neighbor who had witnessed the scene at the airport. She had shared the story with friends and neighbors, emphasizing John's humility and the profound impact he had on those around him. One evening, as John was tending to his small garden, a young man approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Hayes?" he asked, his voice uncertain. John looked up, wiping his hands on a towel. "Yes. I'm Kevin. My grandmother lives a few houses down. She told me about what happened on your flight. I just wanted to say, thank you. For your service and for showing people what true dignity looks like." John smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you, Kevin. It's always good to know that kindness still matters." Kevin nodded, then hesitated. "Actually, I was wondering if you might be willing to speak at my school. We're studying the history of the Vietnam War, and I think it would mean a lot to the students to hear your perspective." John paused, taken aback. He had never considered himself much of a speaker, but the earnestness in Kevin's eyes made him reconsider. "I'd be honored," he said finally. The school assembly. A week later, John stood in front of a packed auditorium at Kevin's high school. Dressed in his uniform, he shared stories of camaraderie, sacrifice, and resilience from his time in the military. But he also spoke about the lessons he had learned since, lessons about patience, humility, and the importance of treating others with respect. The students listened intently, their eyes wide with curiosity and admiration. For many of them, John's words were a window into a world they had only read about in textbooks. But more than that, they were a lesson in character, an example of how to carry oneself with grace, even in the face of adversity. At the end of his speech, the auditorium erupted into applause. Kevin approached John afterward, his expression filled with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. You've inspired all of us. John placed a hand on Kevin's shoulder. The world needs more young people like you, Kevin. Keep asking questions and seeking answers. That's how we grow. A father's legacy. That evening, as John and Michael sat on the porch of their home, Michael turned to his father. You know, Dad, it feels like everything you've done, your service, the way you've lived your life, it's all coming full circle. John nodded thoughtfully. Maybe. Or maybe it's just a reminder that the smallest actions can leave the biggest impact. Michael smiled. Well, whatever it is, I'm proud of you. And I hope one day I can leave a legacy as meaningful as yours. John looked at his son, his expression softening. You already have, Michael. Every day, you make a difference. That's all any of us can do. Seeds of change. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Hayes home, casting a warm light on the living room where John sat in his favorite armchair. The worn, comfortable seat was his sanctuary, a place where he could reflect in quiet moments. This morning, however, his thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Michael opened it to find Lucy standing on the porch, her expression a mix of nervousness and determination. She clutched a manila folder in her hands and offered a hesitant smile. Mr. Hayes, she said when John appeared behind his son, I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to share something with you. John raised an eyebrow but nodded for her to come inside. Michael guided her to the living room, offering her a seat on the couch. Lucy hesitated, then sat, holding the folder tightly in her lap. I've been working on something since our flight, she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. Meeting you made me realize how often we overlook people who have given so much for others. I wanted to do something to change that. She opened the folder and handed John a printed proposal. This is the Veteran Recognition Program I've been developing for the airline. It's designed to honor veterans like you by providing complimentary upgrades, personalized service, and tokens of appreciation during their flights. It's my way of saying thank you and ensuring that no one else makes the same mistakes I did. John took the document, scanning it thoughtfully. Michael leaned over his shoulder, reading along, a smile spreading across his face. This is impressive, Michael said. It's thoughtful and practical. Dad, what do you think? John looked up, his gaze steady. I think it's a good start, he said. But respect shouldn't be limited to veterans. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from. Lucy nodded, her expression earnest. You're absolutely right, Mr. Hayes. This program is just the beginning. I wanted to inspire a culture shift, not just in our airline but everywhere. John smiled faintly. Then you're on the right path. Change starts with small steps. The proposal takes flight. Over the next few weeks, Lucy worked tirelessly to bring the Veteran Recognition Program to life. She presented it to the airline's senior management, who were initially skeptical but impressed by her passion and dedication. With Michael's support, his influence as the airline's owner carrying significant weight, the program was approved for a trial run. The announcement sparked interest across the company. Training sessions were organized to educate staff about the program and the importance of honoring veterans. Lucy led many of these sessions, sharing stories of her encounter with John and the lessons she had learned. Respect isn't about titles or appearances, she told the employees during one session. It's about seeing the humanity in every person. And veterans like Mr. Hayes remind us of the sacrifices made to ensure we have the freedom to pursue our dreams. Her words resonated, sparking a shift in the way employees viewed their roles. The program's launch was scheduled to coincide with Veterans Day, and the airline planned a special ceremony at Atlanta's airport to honor its first participants. The ceremony. On Veterans Day, the airport buzzed with excitement as travelers paused to watch the ceremony unfold. A small stage had been set up in the main terminal, decorated with American flags and a banner that read, "Honoring Our Heroes." John was the guest of honor, though he had been reluctant to accept the spotlight. Dressed in his uniform, he stood beside Michael, who had insisted on being there to support his father. Lucy stood nearby, her expression a mix of pride and gratitude. As the airline's CEO took the stage to deliver a speech, he acknowledged Lucy's role in creating the program. "This initiative wouldn't have been possible without the vision and dedication of one of our own, Lucy Carter," he said. Her encounter with Mr. John Hayes reminded us all of the importance of respect, humility, and gratitude. The crowd applauded as Lucy stepped forward, her cheeks flushed with emotion. She spoke briefly, her voice steady. "This program isn't just about honoring veterans, it's about honoring humanity. It's about recognizing the sacrifices and resilience of those who have shaped our world." Finally, John was invited to the stage. He approached the microphone with his characteristic calm, looking out at the crowd. "I didn't serve for recognition," he began. "I served because I believed in something greater than myself. But today, seeing this program come to life, I'm reminded that even small gestures can have a profound impact." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "Respect isn't something we earn through our uniforms or our titles. It's something we give freely, because it's the right thing to do. And I hope this program inspires all of us to carry that respect beyond these walls." The applause was thunderous, and John stepped back, his expression humble. Michael patted his father on the shoulder, his pride evident. Ripples in the community. The Veteran Recognition Program quickly gained traction, drawing attention from media outlets and other airlines. Stories about John Hayes began to circulate, highlighting not just his role in inspiring the initiative but also his life of quiet dignity and service. In his community, John became something of a local hero. Neighbors who had once only known him as the quiet man down the street now saw him in a new light. Schools invited him to speak to students about his experiences, and local organizations sought his advice on how to create programs that honored veterans. For John, however, the recognition was secondary to the connections he was building. He spent his days visiting schools, mentoring young people, and reconnecting with old friends. His bond with Thomas deepened, and the two men often met to reminisce and reflect on their journeys. A father's reflection. One evening, as John and Michael sat on the porch, Michael turned to his father. "Dad, did you ever think your story would have this kind of impact?" John shook his head, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "Not in a million years. But it's not about my story, Michael. It's about the people it touches and the changes it inspires." Michael nodded, his admiration for his father growing with each passing day. "You've taught me so much, Dad. About patience, humility, and the importance of doing what's right." John placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze steady. "And you've shown me that the lessons we pass on can grow in ways we never imagined. I'm proud of you, Michael. You've built something meaningful. A legacy of impact." The weeks following the launch of the Veteran Recognition Program were a whirlwind of activity. The program quickly gained momentum, garnering attention from media outlets, social organizations, and even government officials. The airline became a shining example of how corporate responsibility could honor individuals who had dedicated their lives to service. At the center of it all was John Hayes, whose story had become a symbol of dignity and humility in the face of adversity. But for John, life hadn't changed as much as people assumed. He still lived in his modest home in Atlanta, tending to his small garden and visiting old friends. The newfound attention was flattering, but he didn't let it define him. For him, the real victory was seeing people like Lucy take steps toward creating a more respectful and compassionate world. A new flight for Lucy. Lucy's transformation was more profound than anyone could have anticipated. After the Veteran Recognition Program's launch, she became a leading voice for inclusivity and respect within the airline. Her story of meeting John Hayes and learning from her mistakes was shared at employee training sessions and corporate events. One afternoon, she sat in her small apartment, scrolling through emails from passengers who had experienced the program. Many shared heartfelt stories of gratitude and respect, but one email stood out. It was from a young veteran who had flown business class thanks to the program. "Dear Ms. Carter," the email began, "I wanted to thank you for the incredible experience I had on my flight last week. For years, I've felt invisible, like my service didn't matter. But the recognition I received on your airline reminded me that people still care. Thank you for seeing us." Lucy leaned back in her chair, tears welling up in her eyes. She thought of John and the quiet strength he had shown on that first flight. His ability to inspire change without anger or resentment had set a powerful example. Lucy resolved to expand the program even further, envisioning partnerships with other companies to honor veterans across industries. A day of recognition. Meanwhile, Michael Hayes worked to ensure his father's legacy reached beyond the airline. He organized a special event at the company headquarters, inviting veterans, employees, and community leaders to celebrate the impact of the program. He also arranged for a plaque to be installed in the main terminal of Atlanta's airport, dedicated to John Hayes and all veterans who had served with honor. The event was held in a large conference hall, filled with banners that read, "Honoring Service, Inspiring Change." John, dressed once again in his uniform, sat at the front of the room beside Thomas, who had flown in for the occasion. The two old friends exchanged quiet jokes, their camaraderie as strong as ever. As the ceremony began, Michael took the stage. "Today, we celebrate not just a program, but a principle," he said, his voice steady and heartfelt. "My father has always taught me that respect is the foundation of a meaningful life. It's a lesson I've carried with me every day, and it's one that has inspired this program." He gestured toward the audience, where veterans of all ages sat with their families. "This program is about more than free upgrades or special treatment. It's about recognizing the sacrifices these men and women have made and ensuring they know they are valued." Michael turned to his father, his voice softening. "Dad, your life has been a testament to that principle. And today, we honor you not just as a veteran, but as a man who has inspired countless others to be better." The room erupted into applause as John stood, his expression a mix of humility and pride. He walked to the stage, his steps slow but steady, and took the microphone. "I don't have much to say," he began, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "What I've done in my life is no different from what countless others have done. But seeing the impact of this program reminds me that even the smallest actions can create ripples of change. I'm proud to be part of a community that values respect and compassion. And I hope we can continue to build a world where those values guide us all." A ripple effect. The Veteran Recognition Program didn't just remain within the confines of the airline. Other companies, inspired by the initiative, began implementing similar programs to honor veterans and foster a culture of respect. Lucy was invited to speak at conferences and corporate events, sharing the story of her transformation and the lessons she had learned from John Hayes. John, meanwhile, continued to inspire those around him. He became a regular speaker at local schools and community events, sharing stories of resilience and reminding people of the importance of treating others with dignity. His bond with Thomas deepened, and the two men often reminisced about their shared past while finding joy in the present. One day, a group of young veterans visited John at his home. They had heard about him through the program and wanted to thank him personally. As they sat in his living room, they shared their own stories of struggle and triumph, finding solace in his words of wisdom. "Every challenge you face will shape you," John told them. "But never let it harden you. The greatest strength lies in staying true to who you are and treating others with kindness." A father's legacy. Michael, ever the devoted son, watched his father's impact grow with quiet pride. He often reflected on how much he had learned from John, not just about running a business, but about living a meaningful life. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, Michael turned to his father. "Do you ever think about what your legacy will be, Dad?" John chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "Legacy isn't something you plan, son. It's what you leave behind in the hearts of others. If I've done anything worth remembering, it's because of the people who've shaped me." Michael nodded, his admiration for his father deepening. "You've left a lot more than that, Dad. You've shown me, and so many others, what it means to live with honor." A closing chapter. As the sun set on that quiet evening, John Hayes reflected on his journey. He had lived a life of service, faced countless challenges, and witnessed the best and worst of humanity. Yet, through it all, he had remained steadfast in his belief that respect and kindness could change the world. The Veteran Recognition Program continued to thrive, touching the lives of countless individuals and setting a new standard for corporate responsibility. Lucy, inspired by John's example, became a leader in advocating for inclusivity and respect in the workplace. And Michael carried forward his father's lessons, ensuring that the airline remained a beacon of dignity and compassion. In the end, John Hayes's legacy wasn't just about his service or his medals. It was about the lives he had touched, the lessons he had taught, and the change he had inspired. And as he sat on that porch, surrounded by the love of his family and friends, he knew that he had lived a life worth remembering.